Hi. My name is Saskia Bonjour. I'm a political scientist at the University of Amsterdam, and I'm super happy to see a full room. It's such a pleasure, well, for you to come and learn about Jacob's book, but also just to have a full room again. I'm still in the post-COVID moment of really enjoying and appreciating that. So let me start by introducing to you the speakers of today. So first of all, there's Jacob Boersema, who is a sociologist at New York University, his work centers on the study of whiteness and racism. You're kind of coming back to your scholarly roots by being here right now. Jacob did his PhD in sociology here at the University of Amsterdam. I was looking a little bit at your CV, and you're truly a transcontinental scholar. Like your work in different ways, like spans 3 continents, between the work that you did in South Africa that you're talking about today, the place where you work and teach, which is North America, and then in the Netherlands also, you remain very involved in public debate, publishing different kinds of interviews and op-eds in national newspapers. And also talking about your book and what you've learned with the National Coordinator on Anti-Racism at the Netherlands Institute for Human Rights, so really an involved intellectual. I'm very happy that you're here today to talk about the book. The book, Can We Unlearn Racism? What South Africa Teaches Us About Whiteness, which was published just this year at Stanford University Press. And then maybe some of you were expecting Darshan Vigneswaran to contribute to the roundtable today. He had to pull back super last minute to his great regret. And then Nawal Mustafa stepped in, which is like, she's a hero. She only learned that she was doing this like 3 days ago or something. So she might not have read like every single sentence of the book, but it's super brave of her to just come here and join us today. So Nawal is finalizing her PhD research at the Free University of Amsterdam in the Faculty of Law. Her work, is it still called Transgressive Behavior of Black Nurses in the UK? No. You changed it. You're supposed to change the title, but the topic is still that. It's about how black women came to work for the NHS in the UK in the 1950s and 60s. She combines archive work and oral history, so talking to people to understand the role of the law in the experiences of racism of these women in the UK. Nawal is also one of the 4 founding members of Speak, which is a platform for Muslim women to fight racism and sexism here in the Netherlands. And then finally, there's Sarah Brakke, who is a sociologist like Jacob, and who is professor of gender and sexuality studies here at the University of Amsterdam. Her work centers on gender, obviously, on religion, on the governance of secularism, and on multiculturalism in Europe. Her current project is called Engendering Europe's Muslim Question, and it's about the role of gender and sexuality in the problematization of Muslims. And I was reading the summary of the project again, and it said how the project, one of the first things that the project aims to do is to move the problem from the Muslim, or the question from the Muslim problem to the European self. And I was intrigued just seeing that and thinking about how that might relate to Jacob's focus on whiteness. So now that you know kind of what's coming, we'll first have Jacob talk about the book. Then we'll have Sarah and Nawal respond, share their first thoughts about the book. And then I hope we can have a conversation, all of us. Jacob, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello. So nice to see a full room for me too. I had a funny thing. I presented my book in New York also, but that was fully online. So I was nicely with 4 scholars as talking. So this is much better. So we're already winning tonight. Also, that was really interesting to talk with American race scholars, with South African race scholars. But I'm very excited today to engage with Dutch scholars and with Dutch people. I already had the privilege to meet with some people, the National Coordinator Against Racism, earlier today, and the topic is on the front of the newspapers about institutional racism, so I'm sure you have lots of questions which we can engage with. Saskia was very generous in her comments, but I do think it's interesting. The book is written by me for American readers about South Africa. So it's definitely a work of translation, and I'm always very interested about how these terms translate, how the perspectives translate. Let me see. Yeah. Talking about changing titles, let me say one thing about titles. So I have 15 minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book. It's a big book. There's lots in it. Hopefully much more will come to the table. But just to give you a gist of the argument, of the ideas that it captures, and sort of the making of. Can we unlearn racism? I'm a white Dutch guy talking about racism, so I'm also talking about myself. So that's why the we is in the title. Before the review process, the title was actually Unlearning Racism. I always teach my students, never put a question mark in your title. You've done the thinking, you got the answer, never put that question mark in the title, and here I am presenting my own book with the question mark. It speaks to, I guess, the difficulty of the question, also the difficulty of answering the question to a certain extent. Was the first question this morning from the national coordinator. Can we? Do you have an answer? And I was like, you didn't read my book yet, because I do have an answer in those first 2 pages. But yeah, I include myself. And I also wanted to emphasize in the title the idea of learning, which I think is very important as an educator. And of course, also teaching, right? What do we teach each other about race? How do we talk about race? What have we learned about race? And I think the word unlearning, the last couple of years, I thought of this idea of unlearning racism 6, 7 years ago. But of course, the last couple of years, everybody, I think it got this moment, this idea of unlearning, right? That we've learned things as a culture, as a group, different countries, that we need to unlearn, that we need to find something to solve. With further ado, let me talk about 4 things. Let me start with the idea of unlearning and how I sort of place it in South Africa, why I think it makes sense to talk about unlearning racism as a South African idea. I don't know if this picture is familiar to anybody. I guess it went global. It was a very dark moment in the United States, summer of 2017, a big protest of white nationalists, white extremists in Charlottesville, and also a big, luckily enough, an anti-protest, anti-racist that protesting. It ended actually in one of these guys driving his car into the counter-protest, killing a protester. But it was a dark moment in the United States. And this guy, which you might know, the former president, Barack Obama, sent a tweet out that was that year, I think, the most liked tweet. But he came up with this very interesting formulation. And I don't know if anybody recognizes the words or the quote. And it's easy, because I'm now going to talk about South Africa, so it's easy. It's the words of this guy, right? Nelson Mandela. So at a moment of crisis in the United States, when Barack Obama intervenes in the public debate, he reaches for the words of Nelson Mandela. And I thought that was very interesting, that he reaches for those hopeful words of the former president of South Africa, and also presents, I guess, South Africa as a beacon of hope where we can learn something from. So you might or might not know anything about South Africa, just some basics, right? 1994, the end of apartheid, start of democracy. From 1996 till 1998, the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, very inspiring process. There has not been a TRC in the United States, nor has there been a TRC in the Netherlands. Some people, last couple of days, were proposing that to me, whether I thought that was a good idea. I thought it was very interesting. In the book, I also critique the TRC for the way they frame issues around justice, the way they frame issues of race, and also partly avoid the language of race. And then this guy standing next to Nelson Mandela, maybe a slightly less famous Thabo Mbeki, the second president of a democratic South Africa. And that's where I start my book, right? So most books are written about the TRC, other books are about Nelson Mandela, the democratic transition, huge debate. But most books stop in the year 2000. And I think that's interesting, or at least interesting also for me to do start there, because Thabo Mbeki really changed the conversation to race, to racism. He was slightly less a fan of ideas like forgiveness, national reconciliation. He thought I should just state it clearly. And he did that in his two-nation speech, which is exactly as it sounds. He was saying, very nice to think about South Africa as one nation, but really there are two nations. There's a white nation, which is prosperous, doing well, and then most people live in a black nation that's not doing so well. So really presenting a divided story. Now, people were critical of that, of saying like, hey, the South Africa's problem is racism, which is surprising, right? When you, country that just came out of apartheid, that you would, but people thought that was too confrontational. And so people came up with another way of thinking, and one of them is a very well-known in the Netherlands, I hope, or I think, Ankie Krog. And one idea that she has in the book that comes back again and again is this idea of learning and unlearning. This is a quote for all the people that can read Dutch that I actually pulled from a TV show where she talks about South Africa teaches me, right? South Africa learns me. Post-apartheid South Africa is changing me. It's teaching me something. And I think this idea of learning, unlearning, definitely comes from her work. Her book, Change of Tongue, has this amazing image of a fish. If you know anything about, I actually know very little about fish, but I've read the book, where she presents this idea of the changing tongue as a metaphor for unlearning racism. And what it shows is how much is needed to unlearn racism. That the eyes are shifting actually from side of the body. And of course, also this idea of darker pigmentation plays on this idea of black and white. So this idea of unlearning, I really took from her, and I thought, you know, how can I study that as a sociologist? How do I have to look at white folks in South Africa to see what they're actually doing post 1994? The other inspiration I had is from this book. It's actually an American anthropologist, Vincent Crapanzano, also in New York. He went to South Africa in the 80s to study not the effects of oppression, but who was doing the oppression, who was dominating, what does domination felt and meant to the people that were dominating. Amazing book, also very critical, and I thought, let me write the book that is sort of the sequel to this original study during apartheid. What happens after apartheid, right? How are things changing for the people? And the lens I use to look at people is this idea of whiteness. People ask me for a definition. This is what I came up with. This is actually a picture from a comic painter that has an alphabet of South Africa where he uses the word white, and he says the many meanings. And what you can derive from this picture is how white has all these resonances, right? How white has so many meanings that we have to rethink, right? That's part of the challenge. So, unlearning racism in my book, I define through two things that I think are important. The one is thinking about how people think about whiteness, so the pro-white part of racism. And then the other side is, of course, the anti-black element of racism. And I think those two things need always to look at in tandem to really understand the process of unlearning racism. Where did I look? I have a chapter on two schools that I compare. What are these kids doing? How do they feel about being young and white in South Africa? I also lived in a gated community where I studied more upper-class whites. Why did they live in a gated community? How do they feel about living in, what does it have to do with whiteness? How does race operate in neighborhoods? And I looked at this very interesting, formerly whites-only labor union. And that became a story that continued as I was writing the book. This is Dirk Herman at one of the protests. White working class, of course, a central idea within the discourse of racism. And yeah, so I'll hold that thought. So what's the argument of the book? The argument of the book is that out of unlearning, always a new racism also emerges. So in my book, I present many white South Africans that are actively reconsidering their ideas about race, about themselves and about others. But also out of that reworking process, we see this new kind of racism emerging that I call white identity politics. Now, I'll explain you what that is. And the idea, the theoretical idea behind it, white identity politics, is that racists keep reinventing racism. I was very intrigued. I think the national coordinators, or one of the maybe it was the College van de Recht van de Mens was asked to actually come up with a definition of racism. And I thought, oh, that's a really hard challenge. I think we can define it, but as my scholarly understanding would teach me that racism actually is constantly changing. And one of the challenges, I think, of fighting racism is to be aware of what is changing, how racists are reinventing ways to legitimize domination. And I'm currently working on a project on the history of racism, and you see that constantly in history, this sort of just reinvention of white domination. I took a picture of the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, which you might know. Maybe you've seen the movie Mississippi Burning. It's often presented as a fringe extremist group. A colleague of mine, a historian at NYU, has written a book about the Ku Klux Klan. It's a mass movement. It was huge in the 20s and the 30s in the United States. These were really the fringe sort of moment, but it was actually a pyramid scheme. I can talk much more about it, but what I want to say is that our ideas of who is the racist, what does racism look like in the real world, is really often off, right? We don't really understand, in that sense, what racism is like. What I also mean with racist reinventing racism, that I was confused coming to South Africa, looking at certain white groups, particularly this labor union. What were they doing, right? What was their game plan? What was their strategy? These people are really ideologues, were very invested. And a couple of things I noticed that what was changing. First was that they tried to get rid of the stigma of being called racist. That's the primary motivation, I think, of any people that have an agenda that other people call racist. They're very invested. How can we go on with this project without being called racist? And to my surprise, they weren't doing away with whiteness. They weren't deconstructing whiteness. They were trying what nowadays we would call normalizing it. Now, how do you normalize whiteness? You do it by presenting a different image of the group. So instead of being called, the executors of apartheid, which the whole world thought was a really bad thing, not the whole world, but a large movement thought it was a bad thing. They started to call, they needed rights. They called themselves a minority without the word white. So they started using this word minority that had all these wonderful connotations of being marginalized, of in need of protection, of being vulnerable. And I thought it fascinating how they rewrote the language. And what they, of course, were doing, they were also using the word of trauma and being traumatized. And what they were doing was presenting themselves as victims of the neo-apartheid, and thereby flipping the script. Like, hey, maybe you were in the past the victim, but now we are the victims, and we need to be protected. Now, if you look at this language, what does this sound like, right? If you use that language, it sounds like identity politics, but then for a different group of people where we don't associate it with, right? So that's why I call white identity politics. It's a group that uses what used to be anti-racism, what used to be language used for the protection of people that were the victims of racism, and reapply it to their own group. This picture, this is again the labor union. Does anybody recognize where they at? So this is the UN building in Geneva. And you're like, what is this formerly white union doing in Geneva? They're applying to get indigenous status. And you're like, yeah, that's not a word we connect with whiteness, right? But what they were doing, they were making the claim that they, as a white minority, were indigenous to South Africa. Yeah, you're laughing. Now, I was laughing too, back in the, and now I'm like, this is a strategy, right? This is something they do. They're very invested in this. And we laugh at it, but I'll get to the kicker in a moment. So, white identity politics, how do I understand it? It's the application of the language that's formerly used for marginalized people to a group that we usually consider quite powerful, resourceful, and with a lot of privilege. So it's reimagining identity politics, which was used to critique whiteness, to critique white supremacy for their own group. It seeks to normalize white South Africans as just another group. This is a language very important. You hear that in Europe too. We're just another group. The white people have concerns too. Now, this is a word you might know from South Africa, white genocide. We had this whole debate the last couple of weeks about the Dutch omvolkingstheorie, right? The general replacement. I think the call for white genocide is just an extreme form of white identity politics, right? It presents the white group as victims of violence from other people, and it presents non-white people as a threat to white people. So it does something very interesting. So what can we learn from South Africa? What can we learn from this story that seemed initially very specific to South Africa? I was watching Fox. I watched it back. Does anybody, everybody recognizes Tucker Carlson, most watched late night show on Fox News. A couple of weeks ago, New York Times presents a huge analysis of his show. He's been talking about omvolkingstheorie, the general replacement, 400 times since the last 3 years. Talking about mainstreaming, normalizing. But who's that other guy that we cannot see? I tried to find a better shot. That's a guy I interview in my book. That's Ernst Roest from the formerly white labor union talking at Tucker Carlson about white genocide in South Africa. So Tucker Carlson is presenting South Africa as a dystopian image from what can happen to white folks. Now, that's a very old trope, I explain in my book. That goes all the way back to the early 1900s when Teddy Roosevelt is talking about it. So that very insignificant, formerly whites-only labor union is on national television. Day later, of course, Donald Trump tweets about it. It's its only tweet about Africa. Right? He never. I think he called Nigeria a shithole country. That's his only other remark, right? But when he concerns with Africa, it's about the white minority in South Africa and these bogus claims about farmers. Now, this is a guy you might know because he's in the Dutch Parliament. He wrote this book, 2015. He's actually getting his PhD at the University of Amsterdam. So this is a very moment. Weird title, right? Minderheid in je eigen land, minority in your own country. I always point out that this idea of minority to apply to what we often consider as the white majority in the Dutch was very strange. Somebody else pointed out this morning that also the claim of my own country, right? The claim of ownership is also very much in the title and in this idea of minority in your own country. But he already presents, right, the great replacement theory, omvolkingstheorie, the idea of white identity politics is very much present already in his book. So it's an idea that's in a lot of people. Now, let me finish with two issues I tried to address in my conclusion. A lot of whiteness scholars that have tackled the problem of whiteness have come up with two solutions that are neither perfect nor easy to execute. The first, which has also, I think, its moment, is this idea of abolishing whiteness. Let's just get rid of it, right? We break it down, do away with. That's the end of it. I don't have that slide. It's one of the first whiteness scholars made that claim, had actually a journal in which he said we need to abolish whiteness. That was his thing. Now, that seems radical, right? And maybe difficult. And also, one of the problems, I think, is that whiteness is connected to all these other ideas that we have. Whether you're talking about the United States or South Africa or the Netherlands, whiteness is connected to how we think about the country, to how we think about our language, to how we think about our culture. So maybe reform is the better issue. But the interesting thing is, and this is sort of the kicker, I think, of my book, white identity politics is a reform of whiteness. So as we're thinking we're changing whiteness, are we making it easier, right? Or are we starting practicing a different kind of politics that has terrible consequences? I'll leave it there. There's much more to talk. Yeah.
Okay, hi. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, yeah. So first of all, let me take a moment for congratulations. So I have to admit, I so often find myself gleaming with pride, with no apparent reason, right? Like having put no effort into anything, but gleaming with pride when I read one of the smart scholars that I'm lucky enough to call my colleagues when they have put a book out in the world. And I had a similar feeling when reading Can We Unlearn Racism, even though Dr. Boersema is not my direct colleague yet, if I may add, maybe, right? So I had this similar feeling while I was reading your book. And so I just want to mark this moment of celebration and congratulations for this impressive and important book. In Dutch, je wint er geen doekjes om. And I wasn't entirely sure how to translate it because the translator says you don't mince words, but I think je wint er geen doekjes om says something else than you don't mince words. But so you don't. And that is one of the qualifications that came to mind when I read the book. The stakes are already in the title. And somewhere in the introduction, you ponder on that question mark in the title, right? Because the question mark indeed assumes that different answers are possible and that the answer could be no. And this is one of the moments that made me uneasy while I was reading, which, by the way, I am convinced that being uneasy when reading a book is a wonderful thing. It's a quality of good scholarship. So it made me uneasy in general, but particularly in a book on whiteness, as a white reader myself, what is this question mark doing here, right? As a human being or as a citizen or maybe in other roles, I can appreciate the open-endedness of the question because I think I know of some of the moments. I can imagine the moments of doubt, of heaviness, where the yes to this question seems far away, right? And is not easy within reach. Or even with, reasoning such as maybe not in my lifetime, maybe in the lifetime of my children. So that heaviness is part of this open-endedness. As a sociologist, however, any other answer than yes remains unacceptable, which we share. As sociologists, we know that racism, and indeed the very category of race, is a social phenomenon, meaning that its story of origins is a social one, meaning it has been learned, meaning the implication being that it must be able to unlearn it, or it must be able to we must be able to do it differently. So this is a disciplinary truth that I want to hold on to, and you do so as well in the book, but not in an easy way, not taking it as a dogma, not skipping over the heaviness and the weight of that disciplinary truth by putting the question mark there deliberately. And also, if I for a moment can skip over the book to the last sentence that says, but who said hope is supposed to be easy? So we go from the question mark to an acknowledgement that none of this, that the unlearning is not easy indeed. You stress the difficulties throughout the book, actually, I think, throughout your analysis. The difficulties, for instance, of taking accountability. And actually, and I want to come back to the question of accountability in relation to whiteness, but my impression of reading the book is that there actually are, you found very few instances of white people or white institutions taking accountability throughout the book, right? But I want to come back to the question of accountability. Briefly, there are many parts of your analysis in the book that I really appreciate. And I also say this as a scholar who knows very little about the South African context. So I learned a lot about the South African context. My comments will not pertain to that context because, it's not, I don't have expertise there. But let me just briefly highlight some of the things that I really appreciated. I appreciate how at several moments in the book you point out the responsibility and the role of social sciences, bringing it close to home as scholars, right? Like not leaving our disciplines and not leaving sociology in particular off the hook when thinking about the learning of racism, the way in sociology we are taught racism, in a sense, if I can put it like that. And as we stand here at the University of Amsterdam, we stand in a particular history in our discipline of how sociology has dealt with or not dealt with questions of race and racism. And in the preface of the book, at some moment, you write about a non-named UvA sociology professor waving away your interest in questions of race and racism. And I first read that and I thought like, oh, you don't have to name the person, I know who you meant. And then I actually had to think again. It's like, oh no, but it could also be that other person. And then I thought like, okay, it's not about a person, and it is indeed not about a name. It is about the state of the discipline in general and European sociology in particular. So I appreciate that, and I hope we can hold on to that in these discussions, because it is also about how we learn racism, and therefore what would it mean to unlearn this racism in social sciences, in scholarship. A second thing that I appreciated a lot is your emphasis on embodiment in learning, and also affects, feelings, and embodiment. already in your discussion early on about unlearning, you argue that the process of seeking truth and reconciliation cannot be the only level upon which to think on the unlearning of racism, that there's also literally the level of embodiment. And you explore that in the following chapters. You explore white embodiment and feelings, affectivity, and so forth, also showing how questions of class and gender need to be taken into account, especially when we think of these white embodiments and feelings. And by the way, in between brackets, I follow your critique there on, well, your critical comment in relation to how Michel Lamont deals with some of with the sociological study of race, not taking it on in a kind of direct way, right? As with the argument that we need to understand how it works through class and gender. And basically, your work shows, like, yes, indeed, we have to do that, and you do that while putting race in the spotlight as well. So I think this is actually the more productive way than what Michel Lamont proposes here. That's in between brackets. A third thing that I really appreciated is how you add layers of complexity to the already complex discussions on identity politics. And I think you briefly touched upon that in the presentation here. When you read the full book, you add more layers there of complexity. Yeah, and there's something I want to say more about that, but I'll come there in 1 minute. So this is briefly some of the things that I appreciated a lot. And then I have 2 questions or commentaries that I would like you to engage in, or that I would appreciate more conversation on. And the first one is back to this question of accountability. And also, maybe I would also want to add the question of material redistribution, which could be seen as one which has a connection to accountability, could be seen as one dimension where accountability could be enacted. I think it might seem to us, but we can explore that more in the conversation, that unlearning racism would require material redistribution, accountability, and so forth. And basically, throughout your analysis, we found little of that, right? There's little also in the truth and reconciliation process. There's little material reparations. There's little material redistribution. And accountability is also something that is quite rare in what you present us in your empirical material. There's one moment when you talk about the working class girls, right, in the school, where the way they confront loss of white privilege and of a previous imagined world, and the way that they form durable friendships with their non-white classmates. That, correct me if I'm mistaken, in your book, what those girls were doing came closest to a kind of hopeful unlearning of racism. But also there, I was wondering, also their accountability is not centrally in what they were saying, right? So I would like you to explore that a little bit more. I'm curious, because also going back to the question of identity politics has become one of the things it has become because it has been, in my analysis, and I think many share that, disconnected from questions of material redistribution, right? And there's a moment that you go back to the original coining of the term of identity politics, which is in the Combahee River collective statement, which was very much embedded in a Marxist analysis where material redistribution, or just the question of materiality was central. So identity politics has become something else because it has been divorced from that question of material redistribution. So that's just one area. I don't have a clear question here, but one area of can we think further about what would accountability look like and material redistribution, and what kind of unlearning of racism would have been possible, which basically you are not finding among many of your respondents, right? Maybe a few, but not many. A second thing, and I will end with that, is on the terminology of minority and majority, and the complex work that terminology does in your analysis. And I think you use the terms throughout the book. The terms are used sometimes in relation to numbers, right? A numerical minority or a majority, sometimes in relation to power, sometimes in relation to identity politics. And I must admit that in one of the early chapters of the book, there were moments that I was a bit disturbed by your usage of minority with respect to the white Afrikaner population during the apartheid regime. So I read the word minority, I was like, you can't call this a minority, right? Because obviously in numerical terms, yes, but you know, why do you call this a minority? And then I know the discussion is open on whether to use the terms minority and majority in relation to numbers or power, right? That is not a settled discussion. And people can sometimes be very upset. I tend to be on the side of using it in relation to power, which means I tend to sometimes say, you know, for instance, women in a minority status, and then I always get, you know, upset feminist colleagues saying you can't call women a minority. So that question, it's an unsettled question how we conceptualize minority and majority. But then when in post-apartheid, of course, talking about that same population with dwindling power, right? Numerical, they are in a minority in terms of numbers. So then I could settle it. Then it made more sense, right? Okay, I still see the power imbalances. But it's like, okay, now I see that there's a becoming a minority going on here, right? So I wanted you to talk more about this minority-majority terminology. And I also realized that there's a difference here of being situated in Europe and thinking through some of these questions with what minority and majority means here, and then the South African case sheds different light on that. So there's all of that. And there's your analysis of what you call white minoritization, right? Minoritization. So I'm wondering about this becoming a minority, minoritization. What that means exactly. And of course, you show us the identity politics that is produced in that process. And we've seen, indeed, in the last couple of weeks, but much longer, we've seen the kind of bloody violence that the replacement conspiracies lead to precisely out of that sentiment of becoming a minority and the threat of what it means to become a minority. And I'm sure everybody has seen, you know, these social media memes saying like, oh, you're threatened by becoming a minority? Do you suggest that minorities are not treated well? Like, you know, that's a social media meme. So what is the threat of becoming a minority and who is threatened by becoming a minority? And so thinking through all of that, and then what is the right terminology? At the end of the book, I also had to think about, going to the philosophers, Deleuze and Guattari, and their idea of becoming minoritarian, right? Which is clearly the opposite of your respondents, the white minoritization of your respondents, right? And I think I want to end there, like, what would it mean to become minoritarian? If we think about, you know, hope and possibilities, what would it mean? What is the effective and the embodied processes that we go through when we become minoritarian in a way that means taking accountability for power relations, refusing refusing ownership, refusing centers of power, but refusing a subjectivity in which we are, you know, the master of one's own ship, so about entitlement and ownership, and becoming different kind of subjects. Now, Deleuze and Guattari are notably not sociologists, so this is like a more philosophical, you know, they also don't talk here about, you know, the material distributions that might come with or needs to come with. But I was thinking of, in your book, because of what you saw empirically, the white minoritization is a scary one, right? It's a violent one, and even if it's not physically violent, you point out rightfully so that this is on a spectrum with the physical violence of the replacement theories, right? It's the same kind of affective and intellectual world that makes some people pick up guns and literally shoot minorities, right? So that white minoritization is absolutely a violent one, what would it mean if we think with Deleuze and Guattari or other thinkers, what would it mean to become minoritarian in a way that makes a society possible with more social justice for everybody? I end with a question mark like you did. So yeah, I'm curious for your answer.
Okay. Wow, it's a really full room. It's been a while. And so I'm not really sure how to continue from Sarah's thought-provoking questions and remarks and Jacob's presentation. So as Saskia said, I was asked to join this panel last minute. So forgive me for my lack of a thorough preparation. I was able to read some parts of the book and the conclusion. So based on that and based on my own discipline and my own research, I've tried to reflect on some of the main themes that you've dealt with. And I have a couple of questions. I think some of them kind of overlap with what Sarah was saying. So I'm just going to throw them out there, the ones that overlap. And then you can think about it throughout my brief remarks. So the first one is the material aspects, right? So I was really wondering and struck by the what does it mean if we reflect on whiteness or racism, if we don't really look at materiality, if we don't really look at what does it mean to not have a house or to not have access to social provisions such as the toeslagenaffaire, right? So it has concrete impact. So I was just wondering about how do we move from like reflections that are valuable and that teach us and make us understand how racism, in this case, how whiteness works and how whiteness is reproduced and how it continuously takes a different form. I really like that aspect about your book as well, because that's something that I come across over and over again in my research in UK. So that is something that I want to highlight, and it made me kind of think about a different way of approaching this. Is the book, I don't know if you know it, by I forget the author, but Hood Feminism, whereby she reflects on feminism from issues that relate to housing. So how does my feminism inform the lack of material equality and inequality, right? So how does that inform? And that's one of the examples that I wanted to go through. So there are three things that I want to reflect on. So before I continue, so I am not a sociologist. Let me say that. I am educated in law, so I studied law in the Netherlands, and my PhD is in the law faculty at the Vrije Universiteit. Saskia sets few words about my biography, but yeah, my research kind of shifted also. I tried to focus on the experiences of Black women and tried to do oral history. However, due to the pandemic, among other things, I couldn't do oral history, and the focus is regulation, and I do reflect on Black women and their experiences, but in a broader context now. So I just wanted to throw it out there. So I read this as a legal scholar as well, right? As a junior legal scholar. And the three things that that I wanted to talk about is the relationship between justice, race, and erasure, especially if whiteness is used as a forum to kind of make claims, right? Claims that were used by racialized minorities to access to redress and to social justice, basically. So how do we understand, and I look at justice from a legal perspective, right? How do we construct justice? What kind of laws and regulations do we need in order to move beyond beyond theoretical discussions, right? So what kind of, and I thought it was interesting that you pointed out that het College van Recht van de Mens was asked to give a definition of racism. legally, there is no definition in the Netherlands of racism, right? There is no legal definition. So that in itself is already interesting. Since 2022, there is no, and I'm not necessarily saying there should be a legal definition, but I think it is important to know that the fact that there is a lack of legal definition. And what does that say? How does justice and claiming of rights work if there is not a framework that you can fit, right? You can fit, there are laws that protect people, but then there is an issue of evidence, right? That's one of the things that people who deal with racism continuously stuiten hun hoofd. I don't know what the English word is. Anyhow, so I was just wondering, how do you? So I was just thinking about that as well, right? So so the relationship between whiteness now becoming an identity politics, whereby white people who have already had access to certain rights, who had access to privileges, how subversive that is becoming, and how does that translate into not only materiality but also into existing laws? How does it change and construct the laws that we have? I'm not sure if you can reflect on that, but because it was because of your experiences with the post-apartheid South Africa, I was really curious about how does that, did the laws change? How do we move? How do we go from legislation that is maybe anti-discriminatory and so on, and promotes equality, to more implementing and to looking at how accountability in that way works, right? So how do you claim making? That's one of the things that I wanted to address. The second thing is solidarity. So have you been able to see, because there has been a lot of activism also going on, and also within scholarship in South Africa. So in terms of hope and solidarity and in a way also a connection through shared politics and shared imagined world, were you able to find forms of solidarity that transgress the boundaries that have been created, and also the subversive ways that whiteness has been working in South Africa, right? So I was curious about that, and what is then the place of identity politics in that? How can you use ideas of identity politics, how do you use that in creating solidarity across different identity markers? The other thing that I wanted to highlight and reflect on is also the issue of class and the working class, and the place of the working class in a racist society. In my research, before I do that, what I find really interesting is the way South Africa is positioned and used in Europe and in discussions about racism. So I do archival work in England. I look at the archives from 1948 until 1968. So it is in a period where England was becoming, Britain was becoming a nation state, going away from empire and struggling with losing its image of being an empire and power as being an empire to a nation state, with the development of welfare state institutions like the National Health Service, the National Housing Association, and so on. So all of these benefits were being created at that time. And when I look at the archives, at the same time, so during the 1948, the migration from previous colonies was taking place in the UK, right? So a lot of black and brown people were coming from the colonies without invitation. That's important because there were people recruited to work as nurses, as staff, in railways and so on. But the large migration from the colonies unregulated, right, on their own account, was happening. And I've analyzed debates and political debates about the introduction of deportation and immigration laws. And in those debates and parliamentary debates, but also within ministries and so on, what you see is that South Africa and the United States are continuously used as a reference point, right, of what not to become. South Africa is interesting in a way because it's constantly also present in the newspapers, right, about apartheid and the evils of the apartheid regime. And continuously you see British legislators reflecting on that and saying, we do not want to become South Africa. We do not want to go have ghettos like the United States, right? At the same time, they're trying to implement racist laws that restrict black people from coming to the United Kingdom. So I think it is interesting to reflect also how South Africa, as a nation, but also how South African racism is continuously used in Europe as a reference point to kind of one that you push away from to promote yourself as a tolerant and multicultural society. And now in this case, I find it really interesting to see that that South Africa becomes also a space that we learn from, right? That we turn to unlearn racism. So I thought that was a striking similarity about how South Africa is used. And the other thing, before I went on the tangent about South Africa, is the working class, right? So in my research, I focus on how the working class is used, who the working class is, and how they're mobilized in the political debates. And it is always the white working class that is used, and that kind of resurfaces in different ways. In my research, what I've been able to trace is that white working class men are often represented in political debates as the violent, white, racist men who attack minorities, who go out on the streets and beat up black people that they come across. On the other hand, when gender is accounted for, what I've seen is that white women who transgress racial and sexual boundaries are labeled as whores, the whore stigma, right? So they become, even though they're not involved in sex work or whatever, they become unrespectable and are pushed outside of whiteness, right? So they become less white just by associating with these men. And also at the same time, the boundaries of white femininity are recreated and reproduced through the image of the white working class woman. So I thought the example Sarah was also giving about white working class and the position of white working class girls and their friendship that they're able to forge relevant for this discussion, because I was also wondering about whose whiteness are you talking about when we talk about white identity politics, and how do you not fall in the trap of stigmatizing white working class groups that also have legitimate material claims towards the state, right? So I was wondering about that. At the same time, how do you reconcile with the racism within the embodied and sort of internalized racism of some of the working class? Because there is a legitimate concern there as well. So I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but I think that is enough food for thought. And we can have a discussion maybe later. Yeah.
Be very brief. Yeah, because we do want to have room for all your questions, which I'm sure are different and also very interesting. I can say a few things, I think, that are helpful to just think. And maybe I do not emphasize it enough in my book, but I think South Africa is actually quite radical in the way it tried to redistribute wealth. I don't think it worked out well. There's a lot of critique, but wealth was redistributed from white hands to black hands. Black economic empowerment, if you would introduce it in the Netherlands, in the United States, would be radical, right? Would be a radical idea, which is really giving shares. Every company needs to have, I think it was 25% shareholders into black hands. That was the idea, and that's what it tried to. It had all kinds of effects that we can go into, but there was real material redistribution, and that is on a scale that is unimaginable, I think, as a policy proposal in the West. Same with affirmative action. I think also was radically implemented to an extent that had strong material effects for the white minority in general. So I think they really, this is something I wrestled with my book, and I tried to emphasize, people did hand it in stuff. People did make place to a certain extent. The best example is the school, I think, because it makes it so practical. I went to this school who had desegregated and what I call had resegregated, in the sense that they, a lot of particularly what in South Africa you call colored students, people of mixed race, you could also say, entered the school. And what actually happened very soon, a couple of years later, white people started leaving the school. And when the moment I come to the school, you could see, was literally, you visit the school, there's the empty swimming pool. There's the tennis court that's no longer kept up. So you could see what the school had been only a few 5 to 10 years before. People would talk about their sisters. The school was different. And I think what I captured was, in the end, basically the last white class, in a sense, these students. And I felt like, yeah, they literally handed in, or let me say that, the school changed for them, right? The material conditions of the school changed for them. So even though I think they were very explicit, often in a lot of remarks that you could call racist, I felt always in the context of loss, like real loss, sort of status loss and material loss. So maybe that's not my focus necessarily in the book. There are many books that focus actually on the economic story. I wanted to talk about the story of race, but you're totally right to say like it's always connected, right? This idea of minoritization, I think, is very interesting in the Netherlands, in the United States, and in South Africa. This idea of why are people scared to become a minority, right? What is it about not feeling a majority, right? How is ideas about demographic numbers are wrapped up in ideas of how we felt secure in our numbers? Yeah, very hard question, right? As a scholar, you're focused on how these numbers are used. So when I talk about white minoritization in the book, what I say is very interesting. This labor union switches, right? When they can use the demographic numbers to their advantage, they'll emphasize. And actually, the guy in his quote, he makes a mistake. He says, "We used to be a majority." He literally says that, and what he means, of course, we used to be in power. So he switches the words majority. They were never a demographic majority, right? They were always a small minority. The apartheid project you could see as projecting majority status on your country, and for those of you that have visited South Africa or still are planning or have heard about stories, when you travel South Africa, you're amazed actually how many white people you encounter, if you're a white European coming from Europe, compared to how many black people you might encounter on your trip and the sort of vision of the country, right? So that still has an imprint, this idea of we want to imprint a majority status, and we, literally going to put, of course, many people in this of color in a small possible space. Apartheid was a project to move black South Africans into 13% of the country, right? It's an incredible number, and they had to move physically, violently, 3.5 million people. Apartheid was not just segregation; it was really ethnic cleansing. So 2 minutes for Nawal, right? Ideas about justice. So let me. I actually am troubled by this idea, like, should I define racism or should I emphasize racism as a dynamic concept, right? I think actually to fight racism, it's very important for us to understand racism as something dynamic. So to sort of codify it in law I would be worried about it. But at the same time, you think like maybe we need that definition to fight racism. We need to know what we want to fight. So I'm really ambivalent. I'm very eager to hear any question about that and ideas, of course. Solidarity. I think if I would redo my research, which I'm not going to do, I would have added a chapter on more hopeful examples. I think they're out there. I haven't spent time with them. I didn't do fieldwork on them. I didn't think this whole 10-year project through to the end. But I think we do have an obligation as scholars, certainly when I raise the questions that I want to raise, to give people very practical examples of what they can also do. As my favorite philosopher, yeah, I can quote a philosopher too. Martha Nussbaum would write about that. The obligation of, she actually was critiquing a book about India that's also very dark about the poverty there, The Beautiful Forever. Maybe some of you read it, beautiful book. And she's saying this writer gives no hope. And we have an obligation, and then she sort of argues for that, and I very much agree with her. Solidarity was present, I think, very much in the Roads Must Fall movement. So when the University of Amsterdam was occupied in 2015, South Africa had their moment too. I have a paper about that that never got published, that's still on the way. But it tells that story, and it's both, it's an amazing movement. It's a movement that started with a guy sitting together in a room like this, a bunch of students, very disgruntled with the white elite status of the University of Cape Town. He lived in a very poor area where people were going to public toilets that were standing in the middle of a number of shacks. He was like, let me make a statement. So he took one of these porta potties, traveled, which I always think about, like he traveled for an hour with this porta potty on his lap, right? And went to the middle of the campus where Cecil Rhodes, the great, horrible colonizer, violent guy, and throws the shit on the statue. And amazing how it worked, right? If you want to create a stir, and we can talk about the rest of the movement, but I think the way he brings together class politics in a way of this is what people are doing every day, this is in this, and here we are on this campus, I think was true genius. And brings his class, race together. Final point, I think, let's talk about it. I think how South Africa is used is still relevant, was relevant in the 1900s. I looked at Teddy Roosevelt, the former president, who they're removing in New York from the front of the Natural History Museum. His statue has a huge statue. I don't know if people know it. Has Native Americans next to it. There used to be a plaque, and I guess they weren't satisfied with the impact of the plaque, so the statue is removed from the very prominent position it had in front of the museum. But he was talking about South Africa as we should not go that way, right? And that was like 100 years ago, and you're like, oh, this is like, you know, you see the front of, I think a year ago, the Telegraaf, huge front page about white South Africans fleeing to the Netherlands, what's happening. One thing I learned in South Africa, that there, it feels every day like crisis. And that's rather just a way of talking about the country than anything else, that I need to immediately leave the country. But of course, it shows how being a minority without political power, of being white without political power, is somehow very distressing, right? And that's the thing we need to figure out. The white work class, I can talk much longer about that, but I'll leave it. yeah. Should we sit down? Yeah?
It's your turn for any questions or thoughts that you might have. I see a question right there, and also a question there, and ooh, lots. And Anna, okay.
Let's do a couple, huh?
Can we do 3? Can you handle 3 at the same time? Okay. The gentleman with the glasses was definitely first.
Thank you, and thank you for other speakers for their comments. I have a question about your last slide of the presentation, what to do with whiteness, not this one, but the other one. You say reform or abolish. And then I guess you are more on the side of reform, which then it makes me think, doesn't that have the danger of what whiteness studies can do at best is to recenter whiteness? And then again, oh, let's talk about the real thing that matters, us. and that creates this understanding of the self as the whole that can decide who is the other and what not. And then you say, okay, but then if we try to understand whiteness, so we can try to understand the power dynamics of it. But this recentering and then reforming doesn't have the danger, because then you say it's too hard, or the language, or whatever, the symbolic order in a psychoanalytic understanding of like the law or the language or the subjective relations. But then trying to abolish this shouldn't go also in hand and abolishing the other aspect that has comes with Western enlightenment that justifies slavery and colonialism, that has its connotations and links to today's capitalist oppression. So by just saying that, oh, just it's too hard, let's just like reform it, isn't that a bit, don't we have a duty, a responsibility? And then when you just say like, oh, abolishment is too hard, it's too difficult, what does that mean? But then you say, oh, Noel Ignatieff, you mention his name without mentioning his name, and then, but then isn't that the whole point of whiteness is not to interpret it, but to abolish it?
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for the long one.
No. Clearly, there was another gentleman with glasses all the way in the back. And then the lady in the middle, yeah.
Hi, thanks for the very wonderful presentation. I have to say for certain I haven't read your book, so forgive my question if it seems a little bit too, abrupt. Well, first of all, I have some thoughts and a question. One of the thoughts I have is this definition about racism. I think there are numerous definitions about racism. And sometimes the racism I hear people speak about is always something I've conceptualized as hate. There is institutional racism, structural racism, aversive racism, so many numerous definitions. So I think that it's not a problem of not having a definition about racism, it's about institutionalizing a definition and accepting a definition about racism. So this is just my thoughts. My question is, the thing that pricked me the most about your book is this concept of unlearning racism. Because when we say unlearning, it connotes the fact that racism is innocent. Whereas from a critical whiteness studies perspective, from the likes of Charles Mills and Richard Dyer and Kende Andrews and a lot of other people, racism is done purposely. So it's a social system, a system of stratification that is done purposely to benefit white people. So, but when you say unlearning, it means that it's done innocently. How do you sort of like answer this question of racism as a system of government, as a system of governance that is done to benefit a particular set of people in society?
Thank you very much. And then a last question for this round was the lady there in the middle. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for walking the mic around for us.
Thank you for the presentation. I'd like to start by saying that I am Brazilian, and from my experience and from what I know from the US and Europe, we have different types of racism. In Brazil, South Africa, and the US is very much based on the skin color. And what I see here in Europe is that it has a lot to do with xenophobia, with nationalism, and thinking about practical examples, a form of racism that we see daily life is, where are you actually from? Or go back to where you came from. So my question is, what, considering that you started by saying that it's a book that was thought and written based on the South African experience, thinking to an American audience, what can we in Europe learn from it? From a racism that is very much based on skin color to this experience, this European context that is very much based on nationality and immigration and several other issues that, of course, they are intertwined, but that also are quite particular.
Thank you very much. Jacob, I'm giving you the mic.
Yeah, let's see if I can answer question 1 with question 3. Those are amazing questions, and and very valid critiques, potential critiques of the book. Let me rephrase that. So to abolish, seeing reforming whiteness as a weakening, right, of the sort of justice claim, let me use Nawal's words, I think is very fair. And actually, that's a point I make in the book, that I say reforming makes it seem nice, right? That we can make whiteness nice. We'll just work harder and then it becomes a nice thing. Partly that's what white identity politics does, right? It tries to normalize whiteness, tries to sort of weirdly rid it of its connotations with power. So I actually point out the problems of both abolishing and reforming. It's not that I pick reforming in the book. I say abolishing. So why doesn't abolishing not work? I think that's also like, if you say, hey, that's the stronger moral claim, one of these points, and I'm tapping in the question 3, I think Europeans or Dutch people think about the Netherlands, nationalism, the nation, very much wrapped up in whiteness. It's not very clear to everybody. It's complex. We should write a whole paper about it. But we can't really, so saying like it's about nationalism or about racism, to me, misses the point of saying like, oh, we should really explore how whiteness got wrapped up with our idea of the country and can we unwrap it? So when I think reform is the way to go, I'm thinking we need to, can we have a kind of nationalism? And some people, of course, in the room, I think also like abolish nationalism. There's a good point there. I'm not a scholar of migration studies, so there's an argument there too. But I would first say, can we make a more inclusive nationalism? Can we deconstruct the whiteness out of nationalism? And you're shaking your head, so you're not happy with my answer there. So many definitions of racism. Fair enough. Institutional racism. I agree with you that unlearning racism sounds somewhat too friendly. It's one way of addressing racism, this idea that you can do something yourself as a group. In the book, I critique the idea of unlearning racism as following a course. And I was talking earlier today and yesterday about people that are trying to organize courses for the Dutch tax business, taxation offices that need a course to unlearn their racism. As a sociologist, of course, I'm very skeptical of that kind of approach. But when we talk about social system, I tend to prefer, and this is such a social scientist answer, but I like to talk about white supremacy, right, as a social system. I think, and it's not a common term in the Netherlands. Even it's difficult to translate, which are often like witte suprematie, and people are like, what do you mean? So when I'm talking about systems, I like to use different terminology, and I think as racism through the idea of ideology, right? So it's sort of very language-based system, and that's, I think, what I'm trying to address in my book, the way language is tied up with racism. That's my answer there. Maybe some more thoughts here in the panel.
Or we take some more questions. More questions. Yeah, sure.
I remember I wrote something down about the question from the person from Brazil about racism in the Netherlands or in Europe, focusing more on status, immigration, nationality status. I think it's both. In a way, because there is a history of anti-blackness, enslavement of people, which is still a current issue in the Netherlands, right? But also in the UK, from what I've been able to research. So I think in that way we can learn a lot from, and also in Jacob's book you read the fact that racism reinvents itself. So I am a bit hesitant to kind of create a hierarchy between racism that is based on anti-blackness versus racism that is based on nationality and xenophobia. Also because a lot of European countries have people who came from Africa and Asia, black people who came to live in Europe and who deal with both, right? So I just wanted to highlight that.
Thanks. There's a question right up front, and I see a hand there.
Somehow expected your mic to come to me. So thank you so much for your presentation and for the comments. Super interesting. My question is actually about your presentation in particular. So I noticed that you really highlight the example of the white working class. And I think I'm piggybacking on the wall and to some degree here. When we make choices about who to attach racism to, and if we choose a group that, quite frankly, is probably not represented in this room, maybe, you know, I have somewhat of a working class background, maybe some others can claim it, but I'm definitely not part of it now. So how does that then absolve the rest of us who do not have this sort of extreme, I'm a minority, I'm going to be minoritized, etc.? So I just wondered how you think about that also in terms of accountability.
Thank you. With the green shirt, yeah, right there.
Thank you. My question is twofold, and it concerns kind of more the methodological aspect of your work. Your method was ethnographic, and what I'm interested in is the kind of field work you did. Did you confront your informants, or was it more collaborative? And also, did your informants read your book? How did maybe the reception go? Is it kind of, because in anthropology there's this kind of, I can't find the word, it's not respect, but it's like we need to be accountable to our informants. And I wonder how that panned out in your research. And the second branch of my question is, how did that impact your writing style, things you were able to say or maybe not able to say because of that accountability? So, and I think also that this is interesting with the question of your book in mind, Can We Unlearn Racism? Because you're researching these kinds of people, so maybe there's like a strong opposition or a possibility for collaboration to be found. I wonder what was your experience with that? Maybe you engaged with it in your book, but I'd love to hear some more right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there one more question up there? Well, the mic travels your way. I have a yes or no question also. Like, did they get the indigenous status? You can answer that later. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm wondering about the materiality, because I think over the past few weeks we've seen a lot of apologies and claims about institutional racism, but then material reparations are always avoided, or are even the fear of those are even a reason to not offer any apologies or accountability. And piggybacking off Nawal's remarks here as well, I'm wondering if any of you have seen any strategies to break through that fear of materiality and to get some material responses, particularly in South Africa. Apparently that has happened more than elsewhere.
Thank you.
Yeah. These are serious questions. Never underestimate your audience. Great question. Am I highlighting the white working class in my presentation, potentially in my book, in a way that diverts the attention from other racists, potentially people like me, elite intellectuals? I hope not. Have to reread the book. I think what happened really was that I was most puzzled by what the labor union was doing. I spent a lot of time with them. I had a friend who was also doing field work. She was white, South African, Afrikaans speaking. She was female, got very different treatment than me. We talked about that. But in the end, I think they helped me a lot because they were so explicit and so active in their ideological agenda. And then I looked at a Chamber of Commerce. I interviewed a lot of CEOs for the book, really wealthy guys who were actually quite easy for me to talk to, which says a lot about probably my status as a European white male doing a PhD in South Africa. And I was invited in their homes. When I think back, like, that's quite extraordinary. At that time, I wasn't as aware. I wasn't as schooled. I wasn't as reflective. But yeah, I spent a whole night drinking wine, debating, and it got quite dark at the end in the conversation, actually, about, the future of South Africa. But what I do in my book, in chapter 3, which is before the white working class, I find actually quite similar patterns with the white elite. So they do a few things different. They're focused on collaboration. They are aware that they need certain elite black people for their project, so they co-opt them. But their strategy is the same. They hire historians to rewrite their history in a way that fits with this idea of white identity politics. But I start my book, and I think this is the more important point, by highlighting the role of sociologists in the project of apartheid, which I was honestly quite stunned to find. Geoffrey Cronje, which Coetzee, the Nobel laureate, calls the mind of apartheid in a famous article, got his PhD here at the University of Amsterdam. And for those of you that read Sociology magazine, which might not be as many, I have been writing about these early sociologists. Sociologists exist 100 years this year. Steinmetz was actually a well-known racist, was the founder of Dutch sociology. Eugenics guy, was really into eugenics, quite enthusiastic about it. So I was like, oh, of course, Cronje got his PhD with Steinmetz, makes a lot of sense. He didn't. He got his PhD with Boersema, who is often defended, including by somebody at the University of Amsterdam, for being anti-racist, socialist. So I haven't read the full PhD, but I'm very eager to find out, what Cronje is writing his PhD in Amsterdam, what ideas overlap with Boersema, how that ties into whiteness. And I'm afraid quite a lot. I also find out another guy, Koolbrugge, is the founder of sociology in Utrecht. Well-known racist in Indonesia, wrote a book about the Javanese mind. Was actually an inventor of a new kind of racism, was moving away from measuring skulls, which was the favorite way of denigrating, to thinking more about the psychological mind of the people in Indonesia. So, yeah, sociologists are on the hook here, and I address that in my book. I say they were very deeply involved in the project of apartheid, and they were very much tied to Dutch sociology. So I think, I don't think I let myself off the hook, or my class of people, which I think is very important, right? To be mindful of that. With the ethnography, confront or collaborate, I must say I listened. I listened a lot. That was the number one thing. Not understanding a whole lot of what I was hearing. Not hearing race initially. I finished a PhD, and in my PhD dissertation, race wasn't all that central. And I got to the United States, a postdoc, and people were like, oh, you write about white South Africans. That's about race. And I was like, oh, you think so? Looking back into my books, like, oh, there's actually a lot of race. It's everywhere. So I rewrote my work, did a lot of thinking, tried to pitch my book, and people were like, very interesting. How does this tie into race? And I was like, need to work on that. Did some more thinking, theorizing, and the product is the book. So it's a complete rethinking of what I initially heard, thought. But methodologically, what I really try to emphasize is that I want to give them a fair hearing. So I give a lot of quotes where they just say stuff in their own words. I sketch their picture. But then I also, and this is, I think, unusual in ethnography, take them to task. In a sense, like, what are they really saying here? Like, am I understanding this right? So I have a methodological appendix, like a true ethnographer, which is something people love to read. And I use a lot of appendixes in my class, where you can really I explain it to my students as like the architecture of the book. Like, what is this guy really doing? How is he trying to build this book and build this case? And I critique a lot of ethnographers that seem to think that ethnography is in tension with race scholarship, is in tension with using even the word race, certainly using the word racism. Somehow that's incompatible with ethnography. And the thinking there is that we should understand people's common sense and not be too moralizing about it. Now, my favorite example here is my sociologist I deeply respect, but I also deeply disagree with, is Arlie Hochschild, who wrote a famous book 5-6 years ago about what used to be the Tea Party voter that turned into the Trump voter. And if you look into her index, you'll find that she doesn't mention the word racism, which is really hard when you write about white Southerners in Louisiana, right? And she actually does use the word racism once. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. Let me look it up. She actually uses it in the context of reverse racism. So she's quoting somebody who says, oh, the whites are now being discriminated against. So I wish I had worked more with the people that are actually in my book. If I was a smarter scholar and ethnographer, I would have done that. But I do have a whole part of my book where I talk about the methodology and the tensions between ethnography and race thinking. The last question was fear of materiality. Do I say that right? And apologies. I think most South Africans, and Desmond Tutu was explicit about that in 2011, regret how the project to address apartheid in a material way completely failed. That was the TRC was divided up in 3 programs, and the program that was involved with economic justice was the worst executed and had the worst results. I think Black economic empowerment was partly a correction to that. But yeah, that is an issue. Could they have done both? Could they have done a better job? Probably, yeah.
It's time. It's time to wrap up. So could they have done a better job? Probably. That's a little bit like we have hope, but it's complicated, right? I want to thank you very much for coming and listening today and sharing your thoughts and questions. There are drinks if you have time to stay a bit and talk some more. So thanks, and I hope you get a chance to read the book. It's really good.